Thank you for joining us today. My name is Richard Locke. I'm a professor of political science and international and public affairs here at Brown, and I currently serve as provost. And I am really pleased to be co-sponsoring the Race and in America series with Professor Tricia Rose and the Center for the Study of Race and Ethnicity in America. And this has been a remarkable series. I hope that all of you have had a chance to see some of the other sessions that we have. If not, they're all recorded. It's been an incredible series exploring the role of race in America and the impact of racism, and in particular, anti-Black racism on individuals, communities, and our progress as a nation. Now, we began this series in the wake of the murder of George Floyd. Yet the intention from the onset was to offer the opportunity for us to consider these issues through a variety of lenses over the course of this academic year, and it's my great hope well into the future. I want this to be part of what we do at Brown University going forward. And we are incredibly fortunate to have at Brown a truly exceptional group of scholars who have been able to guide our learning experiences, because this is what they work on. Their research and teaching is very much focused on racism, studying race in America, anti-Black racism, and trying to help us understand how it is interwoven into the fabric of our country. And through their incredible work and the analysis that they share with us, help us to question, but also to refine our own ideas and to sharpen our knowledge and perspectives. It's really been an incredible series. And I think those of you who haven't had a chance to look at all the other sessions, please go visit this either on the Provost Office website or on the CSREA website. Now, today we are joined by an incredible group of scholars who will offer their insights into the interplay of race, punishment, and criminal justice in the United States. And I'd like to thank our panelists for taking the time to be with us today and to share with us the incredible work that they do. I also want to offer special thanks to my friend and colleague, Robert Self, who will introduce our speakers and also moderate the question and answer period following their presentations. Let me just say a couple words about Robert, and then I'll turn it over to him. Robert Self is the Mary Ann Lippitt Professor of American History here at Brown. His interests range widely over urban history, the history of American politics and political culture, and American society and culture in the long post-World War II era. He joined Brown in 2004 and has been just an exceptional teacher and scholar, winning many awards for his teaching, for his scholarship, etc. He has written numerous articles, essays, chapters, and has co-authored several books, and authored and co-authored several books, including All in the Family, The Realignment of American Democracy Since the 1960s, and American Babylon, Race and the Struggle for Post-War Oakland. He is now engaged in 2 book projects, which we'll be able to send you a link to if you want to learn more about it. His work is just incredible. He's been a great teacher, a great scholar. He served as the chair of the history department for a number of years and did an amazing job. He and everyone else on this panel today are true assets of Brown University. So please join me in welcoming Robert Self. And thank you all for being here and for participating in this session.
Thank you, Provost Locke. It's a great pleasure to be taking part in this important series and serving as moderator of today's panel. I would also like to thank Professor Tricia Rose, Director of the Center for the Study of Race and Ethnicity in America, for sponsoring this year-long series of which today's session is part. There may be no area of society more revealing of the raw effects of racism and structural inequality than criminal justice. At every stage or location within that system, from first encounters with police, through arrests, arraignments, pleas, sentencing, incarceration, and even release, people of color, and particularly Black people, are disproportionately affected. They, their families, and communities bearing the disproportionate costs. Those costs are most immediately and horrifically seen in the long list of women and men killed by police violence directly. But the system's consequences for communities of color are wider and deeper and extend into the social fabric of everyday life. I come to these questions, as Provost Locke said, myself as a historian and a member of the history department here at Brown. From a historical perspective, two things are evident. One is that the entwining of racism and punishment has a centuries-long history in the Americas, dating to conquest and slavery. The second, more recently, is that since the 1970s, the criminal justice system in the United States has experienced an explosive expansion. To take just one metric of that growth, imprisonment, in the last quarter of the 20th century, the incarceration rate in the United States increased fivefold. Today, the United States has just under 5% of the Earth's human population, but 20% of its prisoners. My role today is to introduce the speakers and moderate the discussion. So let me say a word about the format. We'll hear from our three panelists, each of whom will speak for 10 minutes from their particular scholarly perspective. Following their remarks and for the remainder of the time, we will engage in a question and answer session and larger discussion with the audience. I may have one or two questions myself, and the panelists may have questions for one another, but we will dedicate most of the time for audience questions and reactions from the panelists. So to do that, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to submit questions. We will try to get to as many as possible in the time that we have. And you can submit questions at any time during the presentations, beginning with the first one. If you feel comfortable, it would also be great if you could identify yourself by name, even if it's just your first name. These remote sessions work so much better if we have a sense of ourselves as a community, as a collective body, as an audience. We have a great deal to cover, so let's begin. Rather than reading the lengthy biographies of our distinguished panelists, I'll offer a very brief introduction of each, and we'll chat out a link to their fuller, more impressive, very impressive biographies. As Professor and Provost Locke said, we are extremely fortunate to have substantial expertise here at Brown to consider this complex subject. I will introduce all the speakers now at the beginning, and then we'll proceed with each in turn. Our first speaker is my colleague in the history department, Professor Amy Remensnyder. A medieval historian by training, she is the author of three important books in that field, including Why the Middle Ages Matter, Medieval Light on Modern Injustice. But she is with us today because she is the founder and director of the Brown History Education Prison Project, a program that seeks to expand opportunities in higher education for individuals incarcerated in the Rhode Island state prison system. Since 2010, she has taught history at Rhode Island's medium security prison. During that same decade, she has taught a course at Brown, much in demand among undergraduates, on the global history of imprisonment called Locked Up. Next to speak will be Professor Lisa Biggs, the John Atwater and Diana Nelson Assistant Professor of Africana Studies here at Brown. She is an actress, an accomplished playwright, and a performance studies scholar. Professor Biggs studies the role of the arts and performance more broadly in movements for social justice in the United States. She is working on a book tentatively titled Beyond Incarceration that records and theorizes the impact of theater programs for incarcerated women in the US and in South Africa. Our third panelist, Professor Nicole Gonzalez van Cleve, is an associate professor in the Department of Sociology at Brown, an affiliated scholar with the American Bar Foundation in Chicago. She is the author of the award-winning Crook County, Racism and Injustice in America's Largest Criminal Court. Her newest book, The Waiting Room, examines social life and the urban landscape around the Cook County Jail in Chicago, and is a collaboration with the Pulitzer Prize winning team at the Marshall Project, one of the most important sources of independent journalism on the American prison industrial complex. Welcome to our three experts. Now let's turn to their presentations. First, Professor Amy Remensnyder.
So I want to begin by thanking Robert for that introduction and also thanking Provost Rick Locke and Professor Tricia Rose for the invitation to participate in this panel. As Robert already told you, I am not a scholar of mass incarceration, that profoundly racial form of judicial punishment and captivity. My own research focuses on captivity in the pre-modern world. However, in my course that Robert mentioned called Locked Up, A Global History of Prison and Captivity, I think about mass incarceration in a global context with students, and we think about its profoundly racialized aspects. I also engage mass incarceration on a local level by teaching non-credit college-level history courses to men incarcerated in the Rhode Island State Prison System, also known as the ACI. I'm going to speak about the local in a minute, but I want to begin with the global. And that's because although mass incarceration certainly has its own particularly American roots, which are sunk deep into the foundation of this country and date really to the foundation of this country, I think it is important to recognize that our long history of the racialization of judicial punishment is both heir to and participated in a global trend of the hyper-incarceration of Black and Brown people. This occurred as prison emerged in its modern form in the 19th and 20th centuries and was deployed by race-based European colonial regimes as an instrument of colonial control. Just to give you two examples among many, in colonial Africa, between the 1930s and the 1950s, the rate of imprisonment was 3 to 6 times higher than that in Europe. Imprisonment was an extremely common experience for Africans in this period, especially for adult men. And the same was true in the white regimes that were the avatars of these colonial regimes. For example, in Brazil, 74% of the prisoners in the Recife House of Detention were of African descent. And as you see here, there are similar figures from Peru, and there are in fact similar figures from across the world. Race-based regimes hyper-incarcerated Black and Brown people to exploit them as labor. But the hyper-incarceration of Black and Brown people also served racial hierarchies by projecting an image of Black and Brown people as criminal by their very nature. The report of the Committee on Prison Discipline to the Governor General of India, this was the British report reporting to a British governor, in 1838, declared the general character of an Indian criminal differs less from that of the mass of his countrymen than would be the case in more civilized and moral countries. In other words, there isn't much difference between an Indian criminal and an Indian because they're all essentially criminal. White colonial regimes in Africa proclaimed that Black Africans were naturally delinquent, and they criminalized various native traditions as delinquency and vagrancy. And a similar phenomenon happened here in the United States, where of course the stereotype of people of color as being naturally criminal still persists. Now, the corollary to this definition of Black and Brown people as naturally criminal is the idea that they cannot be changed. Hence, people of color were very often excluded from the ideals of reform that animated the modern prison, places that their creators call houses of correction and laboratories of virtue. As French colonial officials in Vietnam put it, prison can be the site of reform, but not for Native criminals. Therefore, in the 1890s in South Africa, there were reform programs for white prisoners, but there were none for Black prisoners. And in the early 20th century in the US, Black women were much more likely to be judged as felons and in need of punishment and to be sent therefore to penitentiaries, whereas white women were much more likely to be judged in need of reform and therefore sent to reformatories. In the fall of 2016, I had an experience that made me wonder if this racist idea of Black and Brown people as unreformable was permeating my prison classroom by denying people of color equal access to what incarcerated students who take my classes and take other prison college classes call the transformative power of higher education. What happened is I was waiting for the students to arrive for the first class of the semester. And as they filed in, I realized I was looking at a group of largely white men, only 5 men of color among 14 students. And the disparity between the racial makeup of my class and the racial makeup of Rhode Island's prison was deeply disturbing. I knew that, like all federal and state prisons, the Rhode Island prison hyper-incarcerates people of color. In 2017, Blacks were 7% of the Rhode Island population, but 30% of the incarcerated population. Latinx people were 14% of the Rhode Island population and 25% of the incarcerated population. And whites were 75% of the Rhode Island population and 40% of the incarcerated population. So why didn't men of color make up at least half of my class? Their underrepresentation, I realized, really shows how mass incarceration magnifies other racisms that pervade US society. The severe racial inequities in US public schools that disadvantage children of color mean that when men of color are incarcerated, they are likely to be often less educationally accomplished than their white peers. So when I constituted the class list for my course in 2016 by asking the director of the Community College of Rhode Island's associate's degree program at the prison, when I asked him to send me 15 of his most talented students, and when he chose them by the seemingly impartial criterion of students with straight A's, it was almost inevitable that men of color would be a minority among them, despite being a majority of the prison population. From then on, I interviewed potential students to find those whose intellectual abilities were not always captured by traditional metrics. My prison classes are still populated by exceptionally talented students, but now their racial composition matches that of the prison. This practice, which is also used by other prison college programs, makes our classrooms really microsites of anti-racism. In fact, liberal arts college programs behind bars are local sites of hope in the fight against the racialization of judicial punishment that has had such a long history in the US and around the globe. Because such programs contest racism within the prison that exacerbates racism outside the prison. And therefore, these programs work against the racist phenomenon of mass incarceration itself. Racism inside the prison can be enforced by incarcerated people themselves, who often self-segregate into racial groups, sometimes with gangs violently policing the boundaries. But prison liberal arts college programs contest such racism by having students of all colors discuss and think together, a point that students have underscored in telling me why they value the classes that I and other brown faculty teach in the prison. The Prison University Project, which was run by Stanford and Berkeley at San Quentin, reports the same effect. According to one of their white papers, participation in PUP was seen to decrease conflict by increasing contact between people of different races. In turn, this helped create a sense of racial solidarity that crossed racial lines. College programs behind bars also contest the racism of correctional officers, which can manifest as racially biased punishment for the infraction of prison rules. And this is similar to the much more well-studied phenomenon of the racial bias in school punishments. Although white incarcerated people break prison rules as often as non-whites do, prisoners of color, especially Blacks, are much more likely to be written up for these infractions by correctional officers. And that is because implicit and explicit bias leads correctional officers to see Blacks as more threatening. Blacks are also twice as likely as whites to receive severe punishment in the form of single-cell confinement. This racial bias in punishment within the prison further tips the scales against people of color. Because if you've been thrown into segregation, you can't participate in prison programs. And if you have a long list of infractions on your record, this can bias a parole board against you. College behind bars programs can mitigate the effect of racial bias in prison punishment because students in them are less likely to be involved in prison violence. And they're also less likely to be seen as threatening by correctional officers. According to the same PUP white paper, participation in PUP was perceived as a signal to COs that students were less likely to violate behavioral regulations. Finally, college behind bars programs also combat the racist phenomenon of mass incarceration itself, because they help prevent people from returning to prison. Access to higher education behind bars can reduce recidivism rates by up to 43%. College behind bars programs can also change the destiny of individuals and thus their families and their communities by, as the same PUP white paper says, instilling higher education as a value for an entire family. One PUP student said that before he enrolled in that program, no one in his family saw college as a relevant or realistic possibility. But now he has one child in college and another in graduate school. And this is something that my own incarcerated students say. A month ago, Congress lifted the decades-old ban on Pell Grants to incarcerated people, making them eligible for federal aid for higher education. Perhaps now more colleges and universities will make a robust commitment to higher education behind bars and will join Bard, Columbia, Cornell, Johns Hopkins, Wesleyan, and Yale, all of which offer to incarcerated people college courses bearing these institutions' own credit. As these universities recognize, in the fight against racism, higher education behind bars is a powerful tool. It counters the stereotype of the naturally and inevitably criminal person of color that accompanied the global emergence of the modern prison. And it also contests other forms of racism, both within the prison and outside its walls. Thank you all very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Professor Remensnyder. I'd like to turn the virtual podium over to Professor Lisa Biggs.
Thank you so much, Dean Locke and everyone in the Provost's office, Professor Rose and the CSREA Media Services for your support and for the opportunity. I'm going to pick up my remarks right where my colleague left off and recognize that the narrative that we most often tell about mass incarceration really centers on the experiences of men, and that is an important narrative to tell. Men have been the primary target of mass incarceration, a policy of human elimination and immiseration that has been unparalleled in its destructive effects, in particular upon low-wage folks, upon working people, upon Black and brown folks, people with disabilities, with substance abuse problems. But if we are to imagine an alternative to the current system, it's important that we paint the fullest possible picture of the policy's impact. And I believe that it is important that we attend to, at minimum, the experiences of women and girls. Very few people in the 1970s would have predicted that the United States would embrace mass incarceration. There were fewer than 6,000 women imprisoned in the country's state and federal prisons, and in many rural facilities on any given night, there were no women at all. According to the Bureau of Justice Statistics from 1980 to 2000, the number of women incarcerated skyrocketed from approximately 13,000 in 1980 to 92,000 by year 2000. That is a 700% increase. During the next 10 years, their numbers doubled again to over 210,000 and reached 225,000 by 2017. For some 40 years, women have been the fastest growing segment of the US adult prison population. And when the experiences of Black women are specifically considered, the data points a still bleaker picture. Mass incarceration produced an over 830% increase in their numbers. Today, the overwhelming majority are behind bars on charges of shoplifting, sex work, and illicit drug use. They are mothers, most often of young children, for whom they were the primary caregiver. Over 90% self-report that they are survivors of domestic violence and of sexual assault, most often of a rape that occurred before they turned 13. And many of them make direct connections between their histories of problematic substance use and those assaults for which they were blamed, for which they received no care, and for which no one has ever been held accountable. But like all survivors, they have not taken society's disdain laying down, stigmatized by the violence done to them, subjected behind bars to a rehabilitative script that is designed to force them to accept their degraded status. They have fought back. And in my talk today, I would like to just share the story of one woman's effort to fight back and the coalition that rose up behind her to defend her life. It's a model that I think contemporary activists engaged in Black Lives Matter and Say Her Name work are looking to, and something that if we want to shift the narrative and shift the practice, I think is valuable to consider. So on August 27, 1974, there was a rape and a homicide in the Beaufort County Jail in Washington, North Carolina, a small coastal town of less than 9,000 residents on the banks of the Pamlico River. 62-year-old white corrections officer Clarence Alligood was found dead at daybreak. He was laying pants down, half naked in a pool of his own blood. Clenched in his right hand was the ice pick he normally kept in his desk. It had been used to kill him in the cell of the jail's only female inmate, a woman named Joanne Little. Little was a petite 20-year-old African-American woman, a first-time offender, and she was nowhere to be found. Born and raised in Washington, North Carolina, she'd been convicted and sentenced to an exorbitant 7 to 10-year bid for breaking into and stealing from local trailer homes. She had a history of running away and of truancy as a child. She'd spent some time in juvenile detention and had a long-term chronic illness. Her illness had left her with some uneven schooling. She was a high school dropout, and there were very few job prospects for her. But in general, folks in Washington, though they grew up with her, thought that she was trouble. So state officials charged her with murder, and they called for the death penalty, invoking an antebellum fugitive slave law that authorized North Carolina police and civilians to shoot to kill her on sight. After a week on the run, she emerged to set the record straight. Under questioning, she told a very different story about life at the jail, revealing that Alligood and other Beaufort County jailers had subjected her to an unrelenting campaign of sexual harassment. They had kept her, their only female prisoner, isolated and alone, with a special camera trained into her cell so that they could watch her as she used the toilet, bathed, and changed clothes. Fearing for her safety, she had put up a sheet to block their view, which they took down. The pattern of sexual harassment, however, escalated night after night. And the night that Alligood died, she said that he entered her cell with a plate of sandwiches in one hand and an ice pick in the other. He stripped her of her clothes and forced her onto her knees to suck him. When he relaxed his grip, she grabbed that ice pick, she stabbed him, and then she ran. Now, the story of the rape and murder at the Beaufort County Jail would galvanize a broad and powerful coalition of civil rights, Black power, student activists, women's liberation, anti-rape, and prisoners' rights advocates to free Joanne Little. The defense, modeled after earlier campaigns to free Huey Newton and Angela Davis, attacked the state's all too familiar characterization of Little as a calculating Black whore. At rallies across the country, women's a cappella group Sweet Honey in the Rock taught supporters to sing with them, "Joanne is you, Joanne is me, our prison is this whole society," in order to build empathy and to break down barriers. But it was an uphill battle. Belief in Little's deviancy and in Black women's sexual perversion more generally was so pervasive, the judge assigned to the case openly questioned whether she, as a Black woman, could be raped. This is in 1974. Okay? After all, as many Washingtonians put it, Little was no Rosa Parks. Now, despite these libelous characterizations, the defense ultimately prevailed. See, Little took the stand, she told her story, and her case was bolstered by the testimony of several other Black women whom Alligood had sexually assaulted while they were in his jail. Her not guilty verdict established for the first time in US history that African-American women have the right to use deadly, lethal force to defend themselves against a white male attacker, including one in uniform. But unfortunately, the concerns that her case raised about gender-based state violence persist. A police officer is charged in this country with sexual assault every 5 days. They regularly target women whom they perceive to be the most vulnerable. In one of the worst cases, former Oklahoma City Patrol officer Daniel Holtzclaw was sentenced in 2014 to over 250 years behind bars for drugging and assaulting more than a dozen Black women, many of whom had histories of sex work and of substance abuse. But he is not alone. One 6-year study conducted between 2009 and 2014 revealed that nearly 1,000 police officers nationwide lost their licenses as a result of sexual violence allegations. 559 of them because of allegations of sexual assault or rape, 154 sexually assaulted prisoners. In 2015, the New York Buffalo News conducted its own investigation, which revealed more than 700 cases of police sexual violence between 2005 and 2015. In more than 70% of those cases, police used their authority over motorists, crime victims, informants, students, and young people in job shadowing ride-along programs. Only 5 of those 700 were women, but nearly all of the victims were women, and they were adolescents, both boys and girls. And unfortunately, these numbers are likely just the tip of the iceberg. Now, why is that? So if you're the victim of police violence, to whom do you report the crime? Right? What kind of police do you call to hold police accountable? If we are to wrest the power of punishment from the hands of the state and invest instead in new systems of accountability, we need to reimagine fundamentally what accountability looks like and stop trying to impose a one-size-fits-all prison solution. There are so many avenues that we might pursue, and I believe we should try them all. We should try everything except expanding the existing system. Municipalities spend billions of dollars every year on police settlements. I think we should prevent the violence and the misconduct from happening. Take a significant portion of police budgets and instead create a myriad of alternative approaches to improving human well-being. Let's fund schools, let's fund healthcare, let's fund the arts, and encourage people to find innovative ways to hold themselves, ourselves, each other accountable. The culture of police violence comes from a society-wide belief that Black women and girls are disposable, and no single set of police guidelines or prison reforms is going to change it. We have to change ourselves. We are yet to recognize and to embrace the full humanity and potential of Black women and girls. So I say to you that the conversations that we are having today, they are an important and essential step in opening up new possibilities and in dreaming the future. And yes, there is much more that we have to do, but we should do it. We should do all of it. Try anything. Thank you.
Let me now turn to the third speaker, Professor Gonzalez Van Cleve.
Everybody, thank you so much for having me. Thank you to Provost Locke and Professor Tricia Rose for this amazing event and these wonderful panelists. The title of my remarks are called Beyond the Jailhouse Walls, Racial Punishment and the Creation of a Mass Incarcerated Neighborhood. And this is inspired by these 2 books that I've written. The first was Crook County, that examined how racism was used, racial stigmas and meanings were used to actually process cases through the largest criminal justice system in America. The largest unified court is in Chicago. But it also has this companion. It is the Cook County Jail, which is the largest single site jail in America. And one of the key findings within Crook County about how racial stigma was used showed that an enormous amount of abuse was normalized and allowed, both on the record abuse and violations of due process, but also informal abuse that just in some ways became a shadow legal system that could be inflicted by sheriffs as well as attorneys and judges. One defendant in the study, his name was Marco, and he talked about being bailed out of the Cook County Jail. His mom had the audacity to ask after bail was passed or posted, when will my son be out? They brought out a Black defendant, even though he was Latino, and mocked the mother and said, is this your son? Also mocking this poor defendant that thought that they were going to be released. And they continued to kind of berate her and see her as uppity. Marco vanished in the Cook County Jail, was sentenced to work in the kitchen, was bureaucratically lost. It occurred to me that there was a slew of punishment that we were not talking about and that sheriffs were using as an accompaniment to the formal legal system. That was the inspiration for the waiting room, where anything could be weaponized, including waiting itself, waiting for your loved ones, waiting to post bond. As I write, waiting can be a weapon, or at least waiting is a way for the state to tell you that your time and thus your life is neither yours to control nor worth very much. So sometimes your freedom does not actually make you free. The criminal justice system can extend its reach into communities beyond the legal system itself. They can abuse you through release procedures, and these informal practices become an extra legal punishment that is widely known and accepted by court professionals, judges, police, and sheriffs. In Cook County, I call the Cook County Jail Alcatraz on California Avenue, because they have literally created a jail that is the size of 72 football fields of racialized punishment. Rather than surrounding it with a moat of water, it is surrounded by poverty and violence, all things that would keep outsiders out, especially affluent people or people that in some ways could exert accountability on this system, but insiders are held in. So for the waiting room, what I did was a look at 24 hours of punishment, a day in the life of this mass incarcerated city, and look at how correctional officers created the conditions upon which punishment and jail logics extended beyond the cells and into the communities. And how do these do jails end up creating the city itself, practices, the rhythms of daily social life? The jail itself is located in a vibrant Mexican-American community. It's called Little Village. Sometimes people call it Mexico of the Midwest. And you see daily life going by adjacent to fixtures of incarceration. So here you see a summer carnival, which is a fixture of summers in the city, and literally the ride kind of goes up over the jailhouse walls and down. So the people on the outside are looking in, and the people on the inside are looking out. You know, we've spent the entire Trump administration thinking about what it means to build the wall, but what we have not realized is that cities across America, people have already had the walls built. They have organized their social life, their daily lives around fixtures of incarceration and punishment. As you leave the epicenter of Little Village and all its vibrancy and head towards that jail, there is a desolation approaching, a foreboding presence. That is Alcatraz on California Avenue. You see abandoned buildings. You see warning signs that talk about violence and talk about police being called. But yet daily life continues to thrive. Mothers and fathers walk their babies to daycare and school next to the walls. But yet mass incarceration in some ways changes features of cities themselves. So in a mass incarceration in a mass incarcerated city, there is a transit system where the buses always point in and never bring people out. And in that respect, those are the visual markers of mass incarceration. And so we in some ways can talk about the statistics and scale and think about how enormous they are. But to see these buses day in, day out, is the true numbers of mass incarceration. If you notice, the buses do not have windows. So imagine the disorienting effects of being arrested within your home neighborhood, possession of a controlled substance or other nonviolent infractions that make up the composition of the jail. And then they route you around the city to arrive at 26 in California, this enormous jail. And by the time you arrive and maybe you're released, you really have no sense of where you are. The disorientation is a complete. And in some days on those buses, sheriffs will threaten sexual assault. They will tell new defendants charged with crimes, wait till you get to the Cook County Jail. People are waiting to attack you. People are waiting to assault you. So in some ways, the psychological threats, as well as the covering of the windows, acts as a type of punishment that is traumatic and terrifying. There were witnesses. This quote is from a man who named Luis, and he managed a vacant lot where people could park for the day. And he said, the first day I was here, it was actually quite depressing. He said, because I see a lot of buses and I know they're filled with kids. And when they release these kids, sometimes they don't have anything to get home. They come with money, but they take it from them and they write them a check when they're released. They are disoriented. They even forget how to take the bus home. I see families when they come out. They are crying. I see a lot of emotions. And in this case, these everyday people act as important witnesses to mass incarceration and its kind of daily rhythms. One of the things that I talk about is this idea of how you are released, because the assumption would be that being released and freedom will set you free, that it's a good thing. Well, depending on how it's done, it can also be terrifying and a source of punishment, and sheriffs orchestrate it as such. I call it the release and the race, and it's a Hunger Games style fleeing from the Cook County Jail. One sheriff yells, "We got guys coming." Within moments, men run with their hands in their pockets into the cement walkways outside of Division 5 of the Cook County Jail. And at first they seem to be running from the jail like it's chasing them. Awaiting these men is the brutal Chicago cold, the prospects of being jumped by a Latin gang that owns the area, and the likelihood that to get home, you will have to walk 15 miles as alone as the night comes. And the violence is very real. And Josh Lott is a award-winning photographer that works for the Washington Post, and he was tasked with going out to take photos after the book was written to kind of bring to life the things that I had seen. And in one visit, he saw a shooting in broad daylight, swarms of police, omnipresent, looking for suspects. And so you have this carceral state constantly patrolling the area in a punitive manner, but yet violence is still escalating, and people themselves do not feel safe. This is the landscape upon which many Black men in particular are released into surrounding territories, where you have Black defendants in some ways in Latin neighborhoods and Mexican-American neighborhoods that are owned by rival gangs, where they are particularly vulnerable. And knowing this, sheriffs would release defendants as late as possible, as pushing the limits to try to create as much uncertainty and violence as possible. This is Darius. Darius was a man that did not run. Darius was a man that stood there in total shock, and he was an innocent man. In fact, when he went to the Cook County Jail and was released, he had a choice. He had a choice to pick up a coat, and the sheriffs had threatened him and said the coat was infested with bed bugs. It meant that all the men were now running in winter, and none of them had coats to shelter themselves and keep them warm on a particularly cold November day. And so Darius was in some ways emblematic of the types of people that you see. Jails are different than prisons. Jails are incarcerated people who have been accused but not convicted of their crimes. And so there are also innocent people that are subjected to this. And I want to end by showing the resilience of how cities can adapt. And so safe houses become are found in fast food places. The only restaurant around the jail is a Popeye's Chicken, and this is where people negotiate to find bail money, go get legal advice from jailhouse lawyers, get a warm cup of coffee if they can negotiate with someone for some change. You see people scavenging for survival. So discarded artifacts from the release and the race. The possessions are put in a plastic bag and people grab them and discard them and run away. This is a pile of clothes. A minister had brought fresh clothes for people. They scavenge and try to find as many things that are warm so they can make the long walk home. And then finally, religious life. People create churches outside the Cook County Jail, and ministers realize that this is a site where churches have to develop to help people cope with the violence of how the criminal justice system transforms communities in this particular way. So there is this fight to make punishment visible. And there was a significant amount of denial in Chicago about the violence of being released, with sheriffs denying that these practices were taking place. Little Village as a community is a vibrant community, but it starts to be defined by these punitive systems, with people constantly adapting to be seen and to be heard as something separate and different from the criminal justice system. So how do we in some ways change this, transform this? I think one way is to bear witness. One way is archiving these narratives of mass incarceration for generations to come. And since the release of The Waiting Room, a charity has developed that is starting to offset many of these punitive practices, giving people a lifeline so that they can safely make passage back to their communities, and in some ways thwart the intentions of the officers. Thank you so much.
Thank you to all of our panelists. Those were extraordinary presentations. We have over 250 people gathered in this virtual space. And I want to encourage you again to submit questions through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. People have already begun to contact us. People have already submitted questions, and we've heard also comments that aren't necessarily in the form of questions. One thing I do want to recognize right at the outset before we get into a broader conversation, and this really comes from someone who submitted a comment during the presentations. This is an incredibly difficult subject matter, and many people have personal experiences of this in their lives, in their families, in their communities. And I want to recognize that this is a scholarly panel and a presentation by scholars, all of whom study and work around incarceration and the criminal justice system, but it's also deeply personal for them, and as I know it is for many of you. So I just want to recognize that the boundaries in this conversation between the scholarship and the study of something and the experience of it are real, and the interplay between the two is quite real. Before we start to get into some of the questions, may I just invite the panelists at this point to say anything after hearing the presentations of the other panelists. Is there anything you'd like to add, follow up on? There's a number of different points I think we can touch on and we can begin to use to advance the conversation, but please let me invite you to do that first.
Well, Professor Self, I want to make one comment to the point that you just made. While I was doing the research for The Waiting Room, I was walking the perimeter of the Cook County Jail, and I received a notification from my cousin that my cousin was incarcerated and was arrested and put inside the Cook County Jail. At the time I was doing the research. So I share that with the attendees to just destigmatize that, incarceration is happening to other families or the disadvantaged in this kind of broad category and broad brush, because many of us are still living through this. And I can't tell you the pain that that you feel, realizing that just between a wall is separating us. I could be a lifeline, but you fear that there's retribution if the sheriffs knew that I was related to my cousin. And I share that because I know so many people in the Brown community are affected by mass incarceration. And I think more of us need to talk and admit that, so we destigmatize these labels, so they can't be used and weaponized against us, if you will.
Can I just follow up on that and say that, Nicole, I think this is a really important point. And I think it's very important for everybody present here today, and really everybody in our society, to realize that having created this monstrous system of mass incarceration, this is a monster that knows no boundaries, and anybody can be caught up in it. A friend of mine who is a white woman, upper middle class, highly educated, was sent to jail by her own sister, who accused her of a felony. And it was not something that my friend had ever thought about as a realistic possibility for herself. And so I think we have to really realize that mass incarceration is a monster, and it can devour anybody. It does primarily feed on people of color, but it can really feed on anybody. So our society is not safe because of mass incarceration. It is in fact put in peril.
Okay, so I want to start with a question about the adversarial that sort of takes off on these comments, and that has to do with the adversarial nature of the entire criminal justice system. And Professor Gonzalez Van Cleve, you write about this in the Cook County book. Professor Remensnyder, Professor Biggs, I think you both have experienced this through your own kind of ethnographies of the system. And that's the ways in which from the moment that people encounter the system, there is built in an us versus them boundary. And I wonder if you could just talk about and maybe provide some specific examples of the way that then race shapes the way that boundary, way that boundary manifests itself. Maybe Professor Gonzalez Van Cleve, beginning with you, because that's such a feature of the work that you've done in Cook County.
So in my work in Crook County, I was an ethnographer that embedded within the prosecutor's office as well as the public defender's office for an enormous amount of time. Over a decade of research went into this book. And one of the things I play around with is racial identity. So I'm a light-skinned Chicana. And so it allows me to kind of pass within those areas. And the judges and prosecutors assumed me to be white. And so it gave me the kind of access to understand, how do these white powerful attorneys talk about race, about defendants, when they think a person of color is not in the room. And that is a type of access that, really fueled how I understood the system. And this us versus them dichotomy was that to be us was to be professional as well as white, and to be them meant to be a defendant, a family member, and the them was understood through the lens of racial tropes and stigmas. They even created their own race blind ways of using or repurposing the N-word. They used the word mope, which was a degenerate offender. And it was intertwined with understandings of the criminal charge. So to practice criminal law, it was almost entirely impossible without understanding these racialized categories that were kind of these binaries, the us versus them. It allowed for an enormous amount of abuse and punishment. Interestingly, in the Obama era, when I first started the study, people did not want to believe that this was about race. And so they said, well, it must be classism. So what I did is I sent 130 research assistants of varying racial backgrounds. They were all from elite law schools, in order to test how race was seen within those courtrooms. And again, when these researchers who were high status, but of different racial backgrounds, were dressed down as the everyday public in hoodies and ball caps, they were treated along racial lines. Black researchers were assumed to be defendants. They were treated in harsh ways, scrutinized, stopped, frisked, whereas white researchers were singled out, were escorted to courtrooms to see gory cases, pageantry of trials. They were given VIP seating next to the judge. So this really allowed me to kind of, from a research standpoint, tease out race in a world where we are trained supposedly not to see race. But it was really an essential part of due process. You could not do justice without doing racism. It helped them to efficiently process cases in this era of mass incarceration.
Just contribute, I think, to build off what my colleagues have said. We know that obviously that people of color do more time for the exact same crimes that white people do. And if you look at the numbers, incarceration rates of Black women, they do more time than white women do. Professor Remensnyder mentioned that in the 1800s, early 1900s, that the first prisons built for women, specifically with women in mind, the reformatories practiced segregationist policies. So if you were a so-called redeemable white woman, then you could go to a reformatory. But if you were Black, it didn't matter what you had done. If there was a reformatory, you weren't going to go. You were going to be sent to the men's facility, where you would be ignored, forgotten, mistreated, abused, and not only put to work, cooking, cleaning, doing work that would support the running of the facility, but also you would be expected to do sex work. You would be sexually assaulted. And, part of the reason the women's reformatories were built was as a corrective to prevent white women from being so treated. That kind of underlying belief that white women are innocent and redeemable, but that Black women are always inherently not only criminal, but a danger and a possible contaminant to the possibilities of white womanhood and the white nation has never been eliminated. There certainly are white women behind bars, without a doubt, but if in any and every community where there is a significant number of people of color. So if it's Latinas in one area or Blacks in another, and Indigenous people in parts of the West, you will see them overrepresented. And it is not because they are more likely to commit an offense. It is that because they lack often the representation, the resources to gain a rigorous representation. As well as these discriminatory practices that are built into the system. I also want to say that, you know, in the 1970s, there was a moment in which Black and white women were trying to work together to address some of the worst abuses in the system. And a model of what has become known as carceral feminism arose instead. So people know about the 1984 crime bill, which included the Violence Against Women's Act, which is a really important, attempt to force prosecutors, force judges, force police to investigate domestic violence and charges of sexual assault and rape. But in the ways that it was applied, it has had a terrible disproportionate effect upon caging men of color and women. So when an officer shows up at the door, they're supposed to do what they call gender neutral policing. So if there's an accusation, someone calls like, oh, domestic violence, I hear my neighbors, going at it. And now what they do under the guise of gender neutral policing is they don't just ignore the woman anymore and just say, oh, it's just a domestic thing. We can't deal with this. Now they just arrest you both. So he may have like a scratch on his face and your face could be totally torn up, but they're going to take you both in under this guise of gender neutral policing. As they're in the house, though, they're going to take a few minutes to, walk around. And if there's not enough food in the refrigerator, they think the house is dirty, if they think your kids don't look like they're being well enough taken care of, they're not generally holding men accountable for those things. The responsibility for parenting is always assumed to be the mothers. So the women who find themselves in these situations, not only do they get brought in on charges of domestic violence under gender neutral policing, but additional charges wind up getting layered upon them. So a policy that's meant to address a problem instead winds up criminalizing women in a whole new different way. And once again, it's low income women, it's women with histories of disability and substance abuse problems, and of course, women in urban areas who are predominantly Black and brown who are their overwhelming targets. So that's another way through policing and the best of intentions, right? Kind of coalition building to create, a law that would reduce harm to some actually gets implemented, not to protect the people who, not to protect all the people, but the usual, the same old, only worthy victim.
Thank you, Professor Biggs. Professor Remensnyder, I don't want to cut you off on this point, but we have so many questions coming in and a number of them revolve around the prison education program. Do you mind if I ask you that question and start with you, and the other panelists can also address that? There have been a number, and maybe I'll just group them together as one larger question and you can address them as you see fit. So Nancy asks, does Brown offer college credit for prison courses? If not, why not? Julie adds, what work has been done with Pell Grants at ACI? An anonymous questioner has raised the question of the potential tension between expanding something like a prison education program and the larger movement for disinvestment in prisons, if there's a tension between those two things. So that's a big variety of questions. Maybe you can start answering and then we can turn to the other panelists as well.
Great, thanks, Robert. Yeah, and thank you all for those questions. So in terms of what Brown is doing, Brown has not offered college credit yet. I have received permission to teach one course for credit to see how that goes. So that is what we are doing so far. We have had Brown faculty who teach in the Community College of Rhode Island program. That program is credit bearing, but it's Community of College Rhode Island credit, CCRI credit. So at the moment, Brown has not offered a course yet at the ACI that offers college credit. And that, the reason that hasn't happened yet, I think that was one of the questions, is if not, why not? It is a large step for elite universities to take to offer their own college credit. Some of our peers have done it, and I think that Brown will be doing it, but Brown has been reluctant to do it, as many other institutions have been reluctant to do it. Berkeley and Stanford, for example, through the Prison University Project, they did not offer their own credit. The Prison University Project has actually become its own university now, Mount Tam University, and they offer their own credit. So Brown is not alone, I think is what I'm trying to say, in not yet offering credit, but Brown is, like some of our very elite peers, moving towards offering credit. In terms of Pell Grants, we haven't been able to do anything with that at Brown because we don't offer credit. The CCRI program, the former director of that, who unfortunately has just retired, he's a remarkable man, but he did a lot applying for those before they released Pell Grants. Just a month ago, there was something called Second Chance Pell Grants, and he was involved in applying for those as well. And then the larger tension between prison education and basically prison abolition or restorative justice is a very valid point, and I could see an argument by elite universities and colleges going in and providing programs that seems to legitimate the system. But what I would say is that the benefit of these programs to the individuals who are the students in them far outweighs this kind of structural critique. I mean, at the moment we have prisons, they're going to be with us for a little while. They're not going away tomorrow. And before they go away, we need to do something for the people who are incarcerated in them so that when they get out, they have opportunities, they have thought through their lives, they've thought through different kinds of paths that they can take, and that they have, as I say, most of them refer constantly to the transformative power of higher education. And we need to be offering that to people who are behind bars, because education is really a right. And many of them, when they were in the so-called free world, that, as Nicole has pointed out, is not really so free, were really educationally disadvantaged. So I think there's a tension there, but the tension isn't significant until we really begin to move towards abolishing prison, which is not where our society is yet.
Professor Biggs, I wonder if you see any similar kinds of effects with theater programs and other arts programs, and the way that manifests itself within the prison system.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I don't currently offer a theater program to incarcerated men or women in Rhode Island, but before I moved here, for many years, I accompanied people who led programs and had been doing it at various parts of the country for over 20 years. And myself, when I was a professor at Michigan State University, I started a program at the men's, one of the men's medium security facilities. And I'll say that those were programs in which, you know, I assumed that people, of course, had done art before in their lives. I always assumed that people, there's always a hidden singer, dancer, artist, you know, comedian or clown in any group. So I really thought about, and I was really trained through the interlocutors that I had worked with before, as well as my own theater training doing community-based art, to create spaces for people to tell their own stories, using improvisational theater as one of many vehicles. And so the shows that I have witnessed or been part of, you know, they're not through institutions that, you know, were doing credit bearing classes. Were really volunteers who came in week after week after week for decades in order to offer workshops. And I think there were several reasons why, in addition to the kind of transformative narratives that other people have pointed to. What I understand as part of the transformation is that for women and men, they became spaces in which they could be much more than what the prison expected them to be, you know, under the friendly theater label. You know, we're just doing theater. You can do all kinds of really fun, technically insurrectionist kind of actions, like you can dance, You can you can be in a scene with someone who normally you would never be able to talk to. You can play characters that are beyond the boundaries of what anybody, often including yourself, thinks is possible. For one moment, you can be a butterfly, and the next, you can be the president. Those kind, and you know that you are seen, heard, and understood, and their contributions, they really, really matter. I'll also say that at one site that I worked with in the on the Gulf Coast, rather, that their arts program really became a space for people to push back against some of the most punitive practices that the prison imposed. So it became a resource for women to think through policies imposed by the warden. And one instance, a new warden decided that it'd be great to punish all the lesbians in this one group, Black women, by stripping them of their uniform and making them wear what he called the pink dress, which was basically a translucent muumuu, which was designed to humiliate them. And when one of the members of the drama club showed up in this pink dress, after people kind of fell out in shock, then they got up and they organized. So, and being, really sophisticated readers of the prison system, they were able to come up with an intervention that pushed back against the narrative that the warden had introduced, that these, Black women lesbians were the cause of all wrongdoing behind bars and in the world. And the policy actually ultimately was overturned. So I think that not only do the arts programs behind bars, as a kind of non-denominational, not a faith-based program, have an opportunity to invite people in to create alternative communities and really reimagine a future, and then put that sucker in action.
There are so many questions coming in, and it's great. As I said, there still are more than 200 people in the audience. I thank you. You can still submit questions. I'll try to get to as many of them as I can. I also want to remind you that this program is being recorded and will be available on the CSREA website, along with all of the other programs in this series, which are there now, and this one will be there in a few days. So tweet it out, spread this around. There's a lot of questions coming in, understandably, about that kind of focus on the solution side of this, that focus on how to end the kind of racialization of punishment, how to deconstruct, dismantle, abolish, et cetera, this system. I think I want to bracket all of those, which are obviously incredibly big, very important questions, but let me maybe bracket them for a little bit toward the end, and I'll ask maybe each of you to address some piece of that. But there's a lot of questions about that coming in. Some other ones that I want to touch on. One person asks about bail reform, and Professor Gonzalez Van Cleve, maybe that's a good one to start with you, and maybe the other, or the broader context in which to think about bail reform is the many points in this system where there's a financial extraction that happens. Bail being one, but of course, as we've seen in cases like Ferguson, fines, fees, other kinds of things in which working class people, poor people have a kind of extraction of economic resources. So maybe address the bail issue, but there's a bigger question there, I think, that we can all talk about as well to get to.
Yeah, so Chicago, Illinois just passed a bail reform law, and that may change the waiting room. That may change, right? The way they're waiting because they're bailing people out and waiting forever. The people are waiting on the inside, people are waiting on the outside. Often you'll see public defenders come up to family members in open court and say, "Can you tell me how much can you give?" Meaning they're draining the entire family, grandmother's savings. And again, for many judges, when they set a fair and reasonable bond, they'll say, okay, your bond is set at $500. It is just incomprehensible for many people and many indigent defendants to be able to pay $500 and just have that under a mattress in a bank in your grandmother's house. And so that's another level of the punitive nature of mass incarceration, is that we literally have a debtor's prison. The end of the waiting room, a man who was incarcerated for stealing a winter hat is found by one of these prayer groups. He's found sleeping by the trash, and they come to him and say, "Are you okay?" And he's like, "Oh no, I'm fine. I just don't have anybody to drive me home or pick me up." And they asked him what he did, and they said he was in for stealing the hat. And then he said, well, the irony is that I found this hat in the dumpster, and he had like a new winter hat on to try to keep himself warm. He had no jacket. And so I think when we think about, Professor Biggs had mentioned these crimes of poverty. You see moms stealing baby formula and winter coats for children in children's sizes. And there's really no acceptance by the judges that poverty is fueling some of these, crimes of necessity, if you will, of desperation. I'll say desperation. And, bail reform is one solution, which is to say, if you are arrested and you're routed into the Cook County Jail, your bail should just be your own reconnaissance. If you are charged with a nonviolent crime, but many of these bail systems, you're getting points for where points or for where you live and whether you had a previous offense. And in some ways, it is so biasing. Even these basic algorithms, in some ways, within them are metrics that preference wealth and preference where you live, and we know that that's racially motivated as well as segregation, et cetera. So I think that is a big step, which is that many nonviolent offenses, you should be out on your own reconnaissance. Many easy things allow people to come back to court. Some people say as simple as a text message that reminds you you're at this court on this day at this time in front of this judge who's in that courtroom, and then having people routing and helping people get to their court. That in and of itself would be an innovation that is so simple, but yet would help people not forfeit their bond. Right now in Cook County, people are scared to go to the bathroom, because if you go to the bathroom while you were waiting and you miss them saying your name, when you come back to court, people are terrified they will get what they called scooped and routed into the Cook County Jail, even after paying their bond. So again, it's like this kind of gotcha mentality that at every step, even with the bond reform, or even if people post bond, there's always this constant threat of being thrown back. And so I think that in and of itself, that kind of gotcha mentality, that widening of the net has to stop, because even with the bond reform, one can imagine possibly still routing back into the Cook County Jail by these infractions that are very minor, right? That are often because of miscommunication or maybe a lack of a cultural knowledge about how to navigate such a behemoth system.
Professor Biggs, a couple of questions have come in that speak to your presentation about women in particular, and the kind of intersection of racism and sexual violence and gender. One has to do with whether part of this process is the treating of young girls of color as adults and a kind of adultification, if you will, of children of color. And another has to do with the resources that are available, in particular to women in prison, that might speak to their unique and particular set of circumstances. I wonder if you wanted to speak to either of those. And thank you for those questions.
Yes, thank you for those questions. I am not a scholar of the juvenile justice system, but I will say this, that definitely we see girls in schools, girls considered to be bred as adults and treated horribly. The dress codes alone, right? And overwhelmingly girls, Black girls, Latina girls, depending on what school district you're in, they get targeted for minor infractions and kicked out of school time and time. Between hair and spaghetti straps, shorts, on and on and on. It's ridiculous how we police the bodies of young girls under the guise of helping the boys in their class pay attention. It's not girls' fault that boys get distracted, and it never has been. As Professor Amy said, education is a right, and schools need to figure out how to hold boys accountable for their misbehavior and to stop blaming girls for their actions. Unfortunately, in women's facilities across the country, there's very little programming for them. They constitute so about 10-ish% of the prison population at any given time, and it's very easy to forget them. So whereas the men's facility will have like an education program, it'll have job skills, it'll have a nursing staff that's on duty. The women's facility will not. They will not even have an opportunity to go outside someplace for recreation in many cases. So part of that is because they're fewer in number, so it's easy for states to say, oh, we're taking care of the guys' needs, they're the majority. And again, men are the majority, and we should take care of those basic human needs. Absolutely. Everybody, 95% of people are coming out one day. It may not be for quite a while in some cases, but 95% of people are coming home one day. Unfortunately, states do not allocate nearly the same amount of resources to women's facilities. They do get regular opportunities for religious study, and religious institutions, churches with a deep commitment to missionary work are heavily behind bars. You can go almost any day of the week, a couple times a day, to a religious service for women behind bars. And their service is much appreciated, but you can imagine that people deserve more than that. They're, like I said, 95% of people are coming home one day. Who are they going to be if we don't give them opportunities to go to any kind of class ever? We never give them an opportunity to explore jobs. If they, the only kind of so-called mental health service they get is a parenting class, taught by the same volunteer again and again and again. After 6 weeks, how many a 6-week program, it repeats again and again and again and again. You're not getting much out of it. Drug and alcohol treatment programs as well, they are not meeting women's needs by any stretch of the imagination, nor are they facilitating the process of family reunification. Women's facilities are known for every facility is known for making visitation extremely hard, and our facilities absolutely make it just almost impossible for women to spend time with their kids in a really valuable and meaningful way. I agree with others that we absolutely, we got to figure out ways of pushing services and support to people where they are. And I think a big thing that we could do is reimagine how we think of facilities so that women with very, very, very small children, newborns, women who give birth behind bars, can keep their babies with them up until age 3, 4. I don't have a cutoff number. There's a lot of good evidence from the few programs that are around that women who are allowed to keep their children, if they have substance abuse issues in particular, they're more likely to stabilize in recovery. And by maintaining that mother-child bond, the children do much, 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 much better.
Professor Remensnyder, I saw you were nodding during. Did you want to add something to that?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that, as Professor Biggs just pointed out, the programming for women is minuscule in comparison for the programming for men's prisons. And this has been a historical trend. This is really, ever since there started to be reform programs in prisons, women had access to far fewer, and they were always typically things like cooking classes, cosmetology. They were very, very restrictive in terms of making you into a typical woman, which a lot of women rebelled against. There have been some studies suggesting that actually women commit more infractions of prison rules, partly because this kind of outdated model of femininity is being imposed on them. But I also just wanted to share that I have over the years tried to get my program into the women's facility. And what I've been told repeated times are several sexist things every time. One is that there aren't enough talented women to fill your class, first of all. There's maybe 1 or 2 women who could do Brown level work. And then the other thing I'm told is, well, the women have shorter sentences, there's too much turnover. And so it's just really not worth you going into the women's prison. And so I've repeatedly come up against this barrier of essentially, no, you are not going into the women's prison.
Professor Gonzalez van Cleve, do you want to speak to that? And I'm particularly struck by the family issue that Professor Biggs raises, and the powerful ways that even having to show up for a bail hearing disrupts family life and all the way through incarceration, and the ways that women experience that in particular as dominant caregivers. And I wonder if you could speak to that from the perspective that you have seen.
Well, I've actually seen so many cases where, and again, it was mostly Black women that I observed coming into the Chicago courts, where you have, and many times, white women judges that are listening or doing the hearings for Black women, and they do not see them as their fellow mothers. They just don't. And so again, and the hostility didn't extend just to people charged with crimes. It was extended to grandmothers that came to advocate for their grandsons. And if we go back to the classic Killing the Black Body, it's this idea that the Black womb, if you will, is born the criminal, right? It's this double this double racist trope about who a Black woman is and her fertility being, quote unquote, so dangerous. And I think, the harshness by which they couldn't ever see Black women as mothers like them. That was not a script that was used within the court, despite the fact that, one time in Kerr County, there was a woman that was sentenced for a very minor crime, and she was only, weeks postpartum. And what you hear is her wailing after the sentence. You hear in the lockup wailing and wail. I mean, it was just this like visceral, terrible sound of pain, just suffering. And the white woman judge, the censor, is like, can you shut her up? Can you just, I lose my train of thought. And they, you hear the yelling and you hear the scuffle in the back, and, you need to be quiet. You need to stop this. And so again, like the first abuse is not just the sentence, right? Like their inability to see her as a mother, as a caregiver, to think that her being pulled away from a child would be disadvantageous to the child, right? Not considering the child is also being, having a sentence, is not being able to be nursed, is not right, is not having their mother, maybe going into child foster care and other types of places, which is hard to get your child back. But it was also the humiliation. I call that a racial degradation ceremony, meaning this was a way to silence the entire gallery, to say, this is what you are. You are not a woman. You are not a woman like me. You are not a mother like me. You are not a good, and that we don't think about those ceremonial encounters that are, again, extra legal. There may not be a court record of that. Right? It's only through us witnessing it that we see it. And I think those are just as important as the encounters that are on the record, right? That are on the record. We have to make visible those encounters to see truly how racism is reenacted for almost the theater of the gallery and the other court professionals as well.
And this is part of, I think, what you mean by witness and bearing witness as part of the a kind of redress.
Yes.
So we have, these are incredibly powerful observations and insights and analyses, and I wish we could continue longer. We have about 5 or so minutes left before 1:30, and I would like to invite each of you to just say a few things in closing, and please do not feel the obligation in that amount of time to say, how we abolish this or how we dismantle. But I would encourage you to maybe just say 1 or 2 things that you would like to leave our audience, which is still over 200 right now, with. And thank you again for all of your questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to every single one of them. I tried to get to as many as possible, but it was great to see the stream of questions coming in and how engaged you were as an audience with the panelists. So maybe we can go in the order in which you spoke originally. Professor Remensnyder, would you like to go first?
Yeah, I mean, obviously I can't prescribe how we're going to solve this problem, but I think that what Professor Gonzalez and Cleve talked about bearing witness, which I think we all 3 on this panel do in our own individual ways, is very, very important. When I first started going into the prison, since I'm not a scholar who works on mass incarceration or the modern world, I realized it was an entirely parallel world. It's a huge universe. If you put all the people that are incarcerated in the United States into one place, it would rival Houston as the 4th largest city in the country. So this is a huge, huge part of our population. And so I think part of it is bearing witness, is realizing that this is the other America, that this is part of America, and we need to all reckon with that. And I think that we should move away from punitive systems of justice and towards restorative systems of justice, where really, rather than thinking about who is the offender, who has been offended against, it's really a process of recreating the community that has been broken by the situation. So I would argue for bearing witness, for going inside prisons. Being inside a prison is a very important experience, not only for the person who goes in, but for the correctional officers to know that people from the outside are coming in and seeing what's happening there, meeting people who have been incarcerated, and bearing witness, bringing that back out, and working towards restorative justice.
Professor Biggs. Thank you, Professor Remensnyder.
Thank you for this question. I think I would reiterate something that I tried to say at the end of my remarks, that there is no one-size-fits-all solution to this question. How do you hold people accountable for wrongdoing? I think one of the great things that I've been seeing over the last several years of Black Lives Matter organizing and Say Her Name work is a real recognition that every person who is behind bars is also often a victim of crime themselves, and that there are many, 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 many people who have done harmful behavior that are not behind bars. And that actually is a good thing. It means that we're finding ways of holding ourselves accountable to one another. And certainly in many cases, our solutions are inadequate. We wouldn't be in the situation that we were in now if everyone felt that every time something harmful happened, that they were seen, heard, understood, believed, and that some kind of appropriate action was taken. But just as everyone here has probably had a moment where somebody, stepped on their shoe and said sorry, we have the capacity to do this kind of work. Unfortunately, our country has really programmed us to be afraid of ourselves, afraid of each other, and to feel like there is nothing that we can do but call the police. But we're actually doing this work all the time and every single solitary day. So what I encourage people to do is to remember, as Mariam Kaba says, that hope is a discipline. It is a doing and a thing that is done, and that we actually have the capacity. We're doing it all the time, every day. We should think through those big questions of, what do you do with the fill in the blank scary people, whatever that scary person might be, and recognize that that person isn't always the boogeyman. They're usually not, even if they are a terrible person, they are often a person who is sit across from somebody at the dining room table, at the breakfast table. They are us. They are not some kind of alien monstrous creature. They are us. They are just other human beings. And no, we shouldn't have to do this work alone. We should do it together. And so figure out who those friends and allies are, and let's get to it. Let's absolutely create the systems of accountability that we need and deserve.
Thank you, Professor Biggs. Professor Gonzalez Van Cleve.
Yeah. So, I think about, what does it mean to witness, to bear witness, and to truth tell? And I think that, to me, that is an important way that justice can be served. We cannot expect a court system that violates people's rights and due process to be a truth-seeking institution. We know it's not. We know it's not. And so one of the things that I think we can do as a Brown community, and what I'm starting to do with CSREA, and I give thanks to Professor Tricia Rose for helping me fund this and think of this, is that I'm creating a mass incarceration lab within CSREA, which is a comprehensive archive of mass incarceration in the United States. But what I want to do is preserve the narratives and writings of those individuals that have been most impacted. And I think that this act of historical preservation and the centering of the voices that have of people who've been mistreated, this is an important act to truth tell, to make sure that the narrative that is coming out of prisons and jails in America is preserved and is told by those who lived through it, so they can reclaim a sense of power, right? And I think, it is important because, how do we as academics, as students, as professors, what can we do? And I think there's an enormous amount of healing that can come from just having your story heard, recognized, acknowledged, and centered as important. So These oral histories and these written works will be preserved in the John Hay Library. We start curating and creating this archive come summer during our summer session. And I hope, again, this is another way to take down these walls. This system thrives this way because so many people do not know. The walls exclude, but if we can create a situation where we can break down those walls and preserve the narratives that truth tell the system, everything from all the abuse and marginalization and victimization that happens, then I think that to me is an act of resistance and an important act of that.
Thank you all for those incredible closing words. I do need to close and conclude the program now, and I want to thank everyone who made this event possible, starting with our panel. Thanks to the CSREA and the Provost Office for conceptualizing this important series. The next in the series, Race and Genetics, is scheduled for March 24th at noon. Please join. I'd also like to thank Media Services and University Events, Marissa Quinn, Megan Silvestri, Hannah Little, and others who made this possible and did so much behind the scenes work to make this complicated webinar possible. And again, thank you to everyone in the audience for your questions and your attention to this incredibly important topic today. Thanks so much.